Some men conquer nations and never once understand what holds them together. Duke Alaric Voss controlled silver mines that funded half the empire's wars, commanded soldiers who had forgotten the taste of defeat, and owned a name that made lesser nobles physically step backward when he entered a room. He believed power was a thing you seized, a territory you claimed, a woman you discarded when she no longer served your ambition. He was about to learn that the quietest person in any empire is usually the one keeping it alive. What follows is the story of how a man who owned everything discovered he possessed nothing at all. Stay until the very end. The price of leaving early is missing the moment an empire kneels before the woman it forgot. The kingdom of Valamir did not elect its rulers. It endured them. And no ruler had forced more endurance from its people, its parliament, its sprawling network of noble houses and merchant guilds than the dominion of Blackthorne. The fortress itself sat carved into the spine of the Ashenvale Mountains like a fist driven into granite, its towers black against winter skies, its walls older than the dynasty that claimed them. Silver veins ran through the rock beneath it. Timber forests spread from its eastern gates to the river valleys that fed half the empire's grain supply. Control Blackthorne, and you controlled the lifeblood of Valamir. And for 12 years, one man had controlled Blackthorne with the precision of a surgeon and the temperament of a warlord. Duke Alaric Voss stood at the window of his private study on the evening before the winter ascension ball, watching torchlight crawl along the castle ramparts below. He was 38 years old, tall enough that door frames required a slight adjustment of posture, built like a man who had never stopped training even after the wars that made his name had ended. His jaw was cut sharp. His dark hair swept back from a face that gave nothing away unless he chose to let it, and Alaric Voss rarely chose to let anything escape his control. "The Whitmore delegation arrives at dawn," his steward Halleck said from the doorway. The old man held a leather folio against his chest like armor. "Lord Whitmore requests a private audience before the ball." "Whitmore requests nothing." Alaric did not turn from the window. "Whitmore begs. He has been begging since his shipping routes collapsed. Tell him he can have 5 minutes during the second course, not before." "And the Duchess, my lord?" The word landed in the room like a coin dropped on stone. Small, precise, immediately irrelevant. "What about her?" "She asked whether the East Gallery seating has been arranged for the ball. She wishes to confirm her position at the high table." Alaric finally turned. His expression carried the particular brand of emptiness that powerful men reserve for subjects they have already dismissed from consideration. Not cruelty, exactly. Something worse. The total absence of interest. "She sits where she always sits, Halleck. Beside me. Silent. Smiling. Looking exactly the way a duchess should look while contributing exactly nothing to the conversation. Is there something unclear about that arrangement?" Halleck hesitated. In 12 years of service, he had learned that hesitation near Alaric Voss was a dangerous luxury. "No, my lord. Nothing unclear." "Good. Leave." The steward withdrew. The door closed with a sound like a coffin settling. Alaric returned to the window and the night beyond it. Somewhere below, in the east wing of the castle, his wife was preparing for the most important social event of the imperial calendar. He knew this because she prepared for every event with the same mechanical grace, the same careful attention to protocol, the same absolute invisibility that had defined their marriage from its first suffocating day. Seraphine Delacourt had been 21 when the alliance was brokered. Her family held no military strength, no political ambition worth mentioning, but they held something Alaric's father had understood better than Alaric ever would. They held the old trade charters, the original merchant licenses that predated the empire's current legal framework, the financial roots that fed Blackthorne's prosperity long before silver was pulled from the mountains. Alaric married her because his father demanded it. He kept her because dissolving the union would have created political complications he did not have time to manage. He ignored her because that was the simplest solution to a problem he had never considered worth solving. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of sitting across from a woman whose intelligence he had never once tested, whose silence he had mistaken for emptiness, whose patience he had confused with submission. 5 years of building his empire on a foundation he had never bothered to examine. The Winter Ascension Ball filled the great hall of Blackthorne with the concentrated ambition of 300 nobles, military commanders, foreign ambassadors, and merchant lords who understood that proximity to power was itself a form of currency. Crystal chandeliers burned overhead, each one containing enough candlelight to illuminate a small village. Banners bearing the Voss crest, a black tower bisected by a silver blade, hung from vaulted ceilings that disappeared into shadow. The orchestra played something elegant and forgettable, the kind of music designed to make powerful people feel civilized while they calculated each other's weaknesses. Seraphine stood at the edge of the high table, watching the hall fill. She wore deep emerald, a color that complemented the darkness of her hair without competing with it. Her face carried the expression she had perfected over 5 years of public invisibility, calm, pleasant, utterly unreadable. No one approached her. No one ever did. The wives of other nobles nodded in her direction with the performative courtesy reserved for women who occupied high positions without exercising visible influence. The men ignored her entirely. She was decoration, expensive, well-maintained, and fundamentally unnecessary to any conversation that mattered. She watched all of this with eyes that missed nothing. Across the hall, Alaric moved through clusters of nobles with the gravitational authority of a man who understood that his physical presence was itself a political statement. He shook hands that needed shaking. He delivered threats disguised as compliments. He accepted flattery with the indifference of someone who had heard every variation of it before the age of 30. And beside him, close enough that the positioning was unmistakable, walked Lady Celeste Arden. Celeste was everything Valamir's aristocracy valued on the surface. Golden-haired, sharp-featured, dressed in silver that caught the candlelight with surgical precision. Her laugh carried across rooms. Her opinions, delivered with the confidence of a woman who had never once been ignored, shaped conversations among nobles twice her age. She was the youngest daughter of the Arden family, minor lords who had leveraged strategic marriages and military contracts into a position of growing influence over the past decade. She was also, as everyone in the room understood but no one openly acknowledged, the woman sharing Duke Alaric Voss's bed. The affair had begun 18 months earlier. Celeste appeared at a parliamentary dinner. Alaric noticed her the way a collector notices a rare object in a crowded market, with the immediate certainty that possession was both desirable and inevitable. Within 3 months, she had private quarters in Blackthorne's West Wing. Within 6 months, she attended every public function at Alaric's side, while Seraphine sat at the far end of whatever table protocol demanded. "Lord Ashford just arrived," Celeste murmured, her hand resting on Alaric's forearm with the casual possession of someone who had already decided she owned the future. "He looks nervous." "He should be." Ashford's nervous because his daughter married into the Pemberton house, and the Pembertons just lost their northern mining contracts. Alaric's voice carried the flat precision of a man who tracked political alliances the way generals track troop movements. "He is going to ask me to intervene." "Will you?" "I will let him sweat through 2 dances. Then I will offer terms that make him wish he had never walked through those doors." Celeste smiled. It was a beautiful smile. Sharp, deliberate, and entirely strategic. Seraphine watched this exchange from across the hall. She did not react. She had stopped reacting to Celeste's presence 11 months ago, approximately 3 weeks after she had confirmed the affair through channels Alaric would never have suspected she possessed. What Seraphine did instead was count. She counted the nobles who greeted Celeste with genuine enthusiasm versus those who greeted her with performative politeness. She counted the military commanders who positioned themselves near Alaric versus those who kept deliberate distance. She counted the merchant lords who had attended previous balls versus those conspicuously absent tonight. The numbers told a story Alaric was not equipped to read. The announcement came during the 3rd course. Alaric rose from the high table. The hall quieted with the trained obedience of an audience that understood silence in his presence was not optional. 300 faces turned toward him. Candlelight threw his shadow across the stone floor like a blade. "The strength of Blackthorne has never rested on tradition," he began. His voice filled the great hall without effort, the practiced projection of a man who had commanded soldiers in open fields. "It rests on vision, on the courage to recognize when the old structures no longer serve the future we are building." Seraphine felt the shift before the words came. She felt it the way sailors feel storms before the sky changes, a pressure drop in the atmosphere of the room that only someone who had spent years reading silences could detect. The Dominion requires a partner equal to its ambitions, a woman whose strength matches the demands of the position she holds. Alaric extended his hand. Celeste rose from her seat and took it. Lady Celeste Arden, Alaric said, and his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who had never once questioned whether his decisions might be catastrophically wrong, is the true Duchess of Blackthorne. The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet the Duke typically commanded. It was the vacuum that precedes detonation. 300 people held their breath simultaneously. Then the room erupted. Whispers became murmurs. Murmurs became open conversation. Noble houses exchanged glances that contained entire strategic assessments compressed into single looks. Ambassador Drykoff from the Marchlands physically stepped backward from the high table, his diplomatic training insufficient to mask his shock. Lord Ashford set down his wine glass with exaggerated care, as though any sudden movement might crack the reality of what he had just witnessed. Every eye in the great hall swung toward Seraphine. She sat at the far end of the high table where protocol had placed her, her hands folded in her lap, her emerald dress catching the candlelight that 300 people now used to search her face for devastation. They found none. Seraphine looked at her husband. She looked at Celeste, radiant and triumphant in silver, standing where Seraphine herself had stood for 5 years of calculated silence. She looked at the 300 nobles, generals, ambassadors, and merchant lords who had just witnessed the most powerful man in the empire publicly discard his wife like a contract that had outlived its usefulness. And she smiled. Not the polite smile she wore at public functions, not the careful diplomatic expression she had perfected over years of strategic invisibility. This was something different, something that lived deeper than performance. It was the smile of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The hall did not know what to do with it. Alaric returned to his seat with the satisfaction of a man who had removed an obstacle. He did not look at Seraphine again. He did not notice the 3 merchant lords who quietly excused themselves from the ball within the hour. He did not register the absence of Sir Brennan Lockwood, his own military financier, who left the Great Hall 14 minutes after the announcement without speaking to anyone. He noticed only Celeste, her beauty, her ambition, her willingness to reflect back to him the image of power he most wanted to see. That night, while Blackthorne celebrated and gossiped and recalculated every alliance in the empire, Seraphine returned to the East Wing. She closed her door. She sat at a writing desk that had belonged to her grandmother, a woman who had built the original trade charter network that made Blackthorne's prosperity possible before anyone named Voss had ever touched the mountains. She opened a drawer. Inside were 43 sealed letters, each bearing the personal seal of a different merchant guild, provincial governor, military financier, or judicial authority. Letters she had been collecting, composing, and strategically delaying for 3 years. She opened the first one. Read it, set it aside. Then she began to write. The morning after the ball, Alaric summoned his legal counsel to the war room, a chamber of dark stone and heavy oak designed for military planning that he now used for every decision of consequence. 4 lawyers sat across from him. Behind them, maps of the Dominion covered every wall, each one annotated with Alaric's own hand to mark territorial holdings, resource positions, and political boundaries. I want the dissolution formalized within 30 days, Alaric said. He did not sit. He never sat during operational briefings. Standing gave him height advantage and forced everyone in the room to angle their necks upward when they spoke to him. It was a small dominance, but Alaric had built an empire on small dominances. Seraphine retains the Delacourt country estate and a maintenance allowance, nothing from the Blackthorne Holdings transfers. His chief counsel, a thin man named Hargrove, whose loyalty was guaranteed by the exorbitant salary Alaric paid him, cleared his throat. My lord, there are complications. Simplify them. The Delacourt trade charters, the original merchant licenses, they predate the current legal framework and were brought into the Dominion through the Duchess's family holdings. Their status in a dissolution is ambiguous. Then make it unambiguous. I pay you to solve problems, Hargrove, not to present them. Hargrove exchanged a glance with the lawyer beside him. The kind of glance that said everything neither of them was brave enough to voice. "We will prepare the documents, my lord. 30 days. 30 days." The lawyers filed out. Alaric stood alone in the war room, surrounded by maps of everything he owned, and felt the particular satisfaction of a man who had just eliminated the last variable standing between his current life and the life he intended to build. He did not know that Seraphine's first letter had already reached Sir Brennan Lockwood. He did not know that Lockwood, the man who financed 60% of Blackthorne's standing military, had read the letter twice, set it down, and immediately dispatched his own courier to the provincial governor of the Eastern Reaches. He did not know that the governor, upon receiving Lockwood's message, had pulled a separate sealed letter from his own desk drawer, a letter bearing Seraphine's personal seal that had arrived 4 months earlier, and read it for the third time. He did not know that 12 similar letters were being opened across the Dominion that morning by men and women who had quietly built relationships with the Duchess. Everyone else had dismissed as irrelevant. Alaric Voss did not know any of this because he had never once asked himself a question that would have saved his empire. What does my wife do all day? 3 days after the ball, the first ship failed to arrive. It was a grain vessel from the southern provinces, a routine supply run that had operated on the same schedule for 6 years. Halleck reported the delay with the careful neutrality of a man delivering news he suspected was worse than it appeared. "Weather delays are common this time of year, my lord." "Find out." Halleck found out. The ship had not been delayed by weather. The ship had been redirected. The Merchant Guild operating the southern supply route had received revised terms from a trading partner whose identity they declined to disclose. The grain was now bound for the port at Ashenmore, 60 miles east of Blackthorne, where it would be sold at market price rather than delivered under the preferential contract Blackthorne had enjoyed for a decade. "Who revised the terms?" Alaric demanded. "The guildmaster claims the revision came from the charter holder." "Who holds the charter?" Halleck paused. The pause lasted exactly long enough for Alaric to understand that he was about to hear something he did not want to hear. "The Delacourt family, my lord. Specifically, the charter is registered under the Duchess's maternal line." Alaric stared at his steward. "Get me Hargrove." Hargrove arrived within the hour, carrying documents he had pulled from the Dominion's legal archives at speed that suggested he had already been looking for them. "The Southern Grain Charter was established 92 years ago by the Delacourt Merchant House," Hargrove said, and the particular flatness of his voice told Alaric that this was only the beginning. "It was brought into the Blackthorne Dominion as part of the marriage settlement, but the registration was never transferred. Legally, the charter remains Delacourt property." "How many other charters are registered under the Delacourt name?" Hargrove set down his documents. He looked at Alaric with the expression of a man who had just discovered that the building he was standing in had no foundation. 17, my lord, including the primary silver transport route, the Eastern timber supply contracts, and the financial charter governing Lockwood's military lending agreements." The room went very quiet. "Are you telling me," Alaric said, and his voice dropped to the register that made subordinates reconsider the value of their continued employment, "that 17 of my trade charters legally belong to my wife?" "To the Delacourt bloodline, my lord, which currently means, yes, the Duchess." Alaric stood motionless in the center of the war room. Around him, maps displayed the full scope of the Blackthorne Dominion. Every territory, every resource, every strategic position he had spent 12 years building and defending and expanding. The empire of a man who understood conquest better than anyone alive. But conquest, he was beginning to learn, was only the surface of power. Beneath it lay the infrastructure that made conquest possible. The supply lines, the financial agreements, the ancient legal frameworks that moved resources from one end of the empire to the other. And those frameworks had never belonged to him. They belonged to a woman who sat in the east wing of his castle, at a writing desk that had been in her family for 3 generations, composing letters with the patience of someone who had spent 5 years preparing for exactly this war. A knock interrupted his silence. Halleck again. This time, the old steward's face carried something Alaric had never seen in 12 years of service. Genuine fear. "My lord, Sir Brennan Lockwood's office has sent word. All military lending agreements with the Dominion of Blackthorne are suspended effective immediately, pending review of charter compliance terms." The words hit the room like siege stones. Military funding, suspended, the single financial pillar that kept 10,000 soldiers equipped, fed, and loyal to the Voss name. On whose authority? Alaric's voice was barely above a whisper now. The whisper was worse than the shout. Everyone who worked for him knew that. Lockwood cited a clause in the original lending charter, my lord. A clause that grants the charter holder the right to initiate compliance review at any time. And the charter holder? The Duchess, my lord. Alaric did not move. He did not speak. He stood in his war room surrounded by maps of an empire that was, for the first time in his life, slipping through his fingers with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent 5 years learning exactly where every finger was placed. And somewhere in the east wing of Blackthorne Castle, behind a closed door that no one in the Dominion had ever thought to guard, Duchess Seraphine Voss sealed another letter, pressed her family's crest into warm wax, and set it aside to dry. She did not smile this time. There was no audience to perform for. She simply moved to the next letter, the way a general moves to the next position on the battlefield, with the calm, absolute certainty of someone who had already calculated exactly how this war would end. The silence in the war room lasted 11 minutes. Alaric counted them without meaning to, the way a man counts the seconds between lightning and thunder to calculate how close the strike actually landed. Halleck had retreated. Hargrove had retreated. The door was closed, and the maps on every wall stared back at him with the indifference of geography, which does not care who claims to own it. 10,000 soldiers. That was the number that kept circling through his skull like carrion birds. 10,000 men equipped, fed, housed, and paid through Lockwood's military lending agreements. Agreements now suspended because a woman he had publicly humiliated 3 days ago had pulled a lever he did not know existed. Alaric pressed both palms flat against the oak table. The wood was cold. The cold helped. It gave his hand something to feel besides the faint tremor he refused to acknowledge as fear. He had never been afraid. Not on battlefields. Not in Parliament. Not standing across from men who wanted him dead and lacked the spine to attempt it. Fear was a currency he spent on others, a tool he deployed with precision to extract compliance from subordinates and silence from rivals. But this was not a battlefield. This was his own house. And the enemy was someone he had slept beside for 5 years without once suspecting she was capable of war. He straightened, rolled his shoulders, forced his breathing into the cadence he used before combat, long inhale through the nose, controlled exhale through the teeth. Halleck. His voice came out level. Good. Level was manageable. The steward appeared as though he had been standing just outside the door, which he almost certainly had. Summon Celeste, and send a rider to Lockwood's estate. I want a meeting, tomorrow. Not a request. Tell him the Duke of Blackthorne does not make requests. Halleck hesitated. The hesitation was brief, but Alaric caught it, the way a hawk catches the twitch of a mouse in tall grass. Something to add? My lord, Lockwood's office specified that all communication should be directed through the charter holder during the compliance review period. The charter holder being my wife. The Duchess, my lord. Yes. Alaric looked at Halleck with an expression that would have made most men in the Dominion reconsider their career choices. I am not going to negotiate access to my own military funding through my own wife, Halleck. Send the rider. Yes, my lord. Halleck left. Alaric stood alone again. The maps surrounded him. Every line, every annotation, every territorial marker drawn in his own hand. 12 years of conquest made visible on parchment and pinned to stone walls. He had taken the Dominion from his father as a moderate regional power and turned it into the single most influential territory in Valamir. He had done this through force, through strategy, through the relentless application of will against resistance until resistance simply stopped existing. And none of it, not one campaign, not one parliamentary victory, not one strategic alliance, had prepared him for the possibility that the real war was happening inside his own walls, conducted by someone who never raised her voice. Celeste arrived 20 minutes later. She entered the war room the way she entered every room, with the confidence of a woman who had decided that her presence was itself a gift to whatever space received it. Her hair was pinned with silver. Her dress was cut to suggest authority without competing with the man she stood beside. Every detail calculated, every angle considered. You look terrible, she said. Lockwood suspended the military agreements. Celeste's expression shifted. Not shock, something colder. Recalculation. On what grounds? Charter compliance. The lending agreements are tied to trade charters that belong to Seraphine's family. That is impossible. Blackthorne's finances operate through the Dominion Treasury, your treasury. My treasury funds the operations. The legal framework underneath them belongs to the Delacourt bloodline, 17 charters, including the ones that govern Lockwood's lending terms. Celeste crossed her arms. She moved to the map wall and studied the annotations as though she could find the answer somewhere between the territorial boundaries and resource markers. How did nobody catch this? Because nobody looked. Because for 90 years, the Delacourt charters sat inside the Blackthorne apparatus like bones inside a body. Nobody examines the skeleton while the body is still walking. And now she is pulling bones out. Celeste turned from the maps. Her face had hardened into something that looked less like the beautiful aristocrat who charmed parliamentary dinners and more like the strategist Alaric sometimes forgot she was. Then we need to invalidate the charters. Legal challenge. Precedent of marital absorption. The moment she married into Blackthorne, her family's assets became Dominion property. Hargrove already considered it. The charters predate the current legal framework. They operate under merchant law, not aristocratic property law. Different jurisdiction entirely. Then we bypass jurisdiction. You control the judiciary. 3 of the 5 imperial magistrates owe their appointments to you. 2. Magistrate Densham retired last month. His replacement was confirmed by the Eastern Provincial Governor. Who appointed the replacement? Alaric was quiet for a moment. The quiet had a texture to it, thick, pressurized, the kind of silence that forms when a man begins to understand that the pieces he thought were scattered are actually arranged in a pattern he is only now seeing from above. The governor consulted with several parties before making the appointment. One of them was the Duchess. Celeste stared at him. How long has she been doing this? I do not know. Alaric, how long? I said I do not know. His voice cracked against the stone walls like a whip, not because he was angry at Celeste, because the honest answer to her question was one he could not bring himself to speak aloud. Years. She has been doing this for years, right in front of me, in the rooms I walked through without looking, in the silences I never bothered to fill. In every moment I treated her like furniture. She was building something I cannot see the edges of. He did not say any of this. Men like Alaric Voss did not confess the dimensions of their own blindness. They adjusted. They adapted. They found the next target and aimed everything they had at it. Call Lord Pemberton, he said, and Lord Ashford, and whoever else still owes us enough to pick up when we send a rider. We need allies. We need them now. Pemberton lost his mining contracts. He has nothing to offer. Pemberton has a vote in Parliament and a son in the Imperial Guard. Right now I will take anything with a pulse and a seal. The riders went out that afternoon, 6 of them carrying sealed messages to noble houses across the Dominion. Each message bore the Voss crest and the particular tone of urgent authority that Alaric used when he needed compliance faster than protocol allowed. 4 riders returned within 2 days, 2 with responses, 2 with nothing. Lord Pemberton sent a carefully worded letter expressing his deep respect for Duke Voss and his regret that current financial difficulties prevented him from committing to any position until the political landscape became clearer. Lord Ashford sent a shorter message. He was traveling, duration unspecified. His steward would handle all correspondence in his absence. The 2 riders who returned empty-handed reported the same thing. The gates of both estates had been closed. Staff informed the riders that their lords were unavailable. No further explanation was offered. Alaric read the responses in the war room with Celeste standing across from him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. They are afraid, Celeste finally said. They are calculating. Same thing. When powerful men calculate, it means they are afraid of choosing the wrong side. There are no sides. This is my dominion. These are my vassals. I elevated half of them. I funded their campaigns, secured their trade routes, protected their borders. Loyalty is not a calculation. It is an obligation. Celeste looked at him with an expression he had never seen from her before. Something close to pity. And if there was one thing Alaric Voss could not tolerate from anyone, least of all from the woman he had chosen to replace his wife, it was pity. Loyalty purchased with power lasts exactly as long as the power does, she said. The moment your power becomes uncertain, every man who took your coin starts weighing it against whoever else is offering. And who is offering? Your wife, Alaric, your wife is offering. The word hit differently now. Wife. 3 days ago, it had meant nothing. A legal designation attached to a woman he had already mentally filed under, resolved. Now it meant something else entirely. Adversary. Architect. The person who had spent 5 years mapping every load-bearing wall in his empire while he built towers on top of them. On the 5th morning after the ball, the food markets in Blackthorne's outer districts reported a shortage. Not a catastrophic one, not the kind that causes riots, the kind that causes questions. Wheat prices climbed 11% overnight. The eastern timber shipments that supplied the castle's construction projects were delayed by what the Transport Guild called scheduling revisions. The silver convoys from the mountain mines arrived on time, but carried 70% of their usual load. The remainder rerouted to a processing facility in Ashenmoor under charter terms that Alaric's officials had never examined closely enough to challenge. Each disruption was small. Each one was precise. Each one targeted a different artery of the Dominion's daily operations with the surgical accuracy of someone who understood exactly how much pressure to apply before a system showed stress without collapsing. Alaric recognized the strategy because it was his own. He had used the same approach against rival territories for a decade. Slow strangulation, incremental pressure, never enough to justify military response, always enough to make the target understand that someone else controlled the pace of their suffering. He was on the receiving end of his own doctrine, and the woman executing it had learned it by watching him from across the dinner table for 5 years. "She is not trying to destroy Blackthorne," Alaric said to Halleck on the 6th morning, standing at the same window where he had stood before the ball. The view had not changed. The mountains still held their silver. The forests still covered the eastern slopes. But the landscape felt different now, the way a house feels different when you discover the locks have been changed while you were sleeping. "She is trying to demonstrate that she can." Halleck said nothing. The old steward had served 3 generations of the Voss family. He knew when silence was the only safe response. Every disruption is reversible. Every charter she has activated can be deactivated. Every trade route she has redirected can be restored. She is not burning the house down. She is showing me she holds the matches. "What would you like me to do, my lord?" Alaric turned from the window. His face carried something new. Not the flat dominance he wore like armor, not the cold precision of a man who controlled rooms by entering them. Something raw. The particular expression of a human being confronting the possibility that the story he has told himself about his own life might be fundamentally wrong. "Arrange a meeting with the Duchess." Halleck blinked. In 12 years, it was the first time Alaric had requested rather than summoned. "Where, my lord?" "Her quarters. The East Wing." "You wish to go to her?" "Did I stutter, Halleck?" The steward bowed and withdrew. Alaric stood at the window a moment longer. Below, the morning light caught the ramparts of Blackthorne, the ancient walls that had survived 6 sieges and 3 civil wars, and 2 centuries of ambitious men who believed that holding the castle meant holding the power. He had always looked at those walls and seen himself, his strength, his legacy, his dominion over everything the eye could reach. Now he looked at them and saw what they actually were. Stone. Cold, indifferent stone that did not care whose banner hung from its towers. The meeting never happened. Seraphine sent word through her lady-in-waiting, a quiet woman named Marjorie, whom Alaric had never bothered to learn the name of until that morning. The Duchess was unavailable. She was conducting correspondence. She would inform the Duke when her schedule permitted a meeting. Alaric received this message in the corridor outside the East Wing. He stood there for 19 seconds, long enough for 2 servants to witness the Duke of Blackthorne standing outside his own wife's door like a petitioner waiting for an audience. He turned and walked back to the war room without a word. That evening, Celeste found him there. He was sitting for the first time in days, his chair pulled close to the table, his hands wrapped around a cup of wine he had not tasted. The maps on the walls looked different in torchlight. The shadows made the territorial boundaries blur. as though the edges of his dominion were already dissolving. "Pemberton will not come," Celeste said from the doorway. "Neither will Ashford. I sent my own riders to 6 additional houses. 3 declined outright. 2 did not respond. One, Lord Kavanaugh, sent back a message asking whether the Duchess might be open to a private trade discussion. Kavanaugh wants to negotiate with Seraphine. Kavanaugh wants to negotiate with whoever is winning." Alaric lifted the wine to his mouth, set it down again without drinking. "What do you recommend?" Celeste crossed the room and sat across from him. The candlelight softened her features but did nothing to soften the calculation behind her eyes. "The Imperial Council meets in 3 weeks, full assembly. Every noble house, every military commander, every foreign delegation. If you present the dissolution publicly with full legal documentation before Seraphine can consolidate her position, the Council will have to ratify it. Once ratified, the charter question becomes academic. Dominion law supersedes merchant law within ratified territorial boundaries. You have been researching this. One of us needed to." The words landed harder than she intended, or perhaps exactly as hard as she intended. With Celeste, the distinction was never clear. "The Council ratification requires a majority vote," Alaric said. "I need at least 60% of the noble houses to support it. Right now, I cannot guarantee 40. Then we spend the next 3 weeks securing votes, not through riders and sealed letters, in person. You visit every estate. You remind every lord what Blackthorne has done for them. You make the cost of opposing you higher than the cost of supporting you." Alaric studied her face. He had chosen this woman because she was brilliant, strategic, and beautiful enough to make every room she entered feel like it had been waiting for her arrival. He had chosen her because she was everything Seraphine was not. Bold where Seraphine was quiet, visible where Seraphine was invisible, ambitious where Seraphine was, or seemed to be, content. But sitting in the torchlit war room, watching Celeste lay out a campaign strategy with the precision of a military operation, he found himself noticing something he had previously dismissed: the eagerness, the speed with which she calculated angles and leveraged vulnerabilities, the absolute comfort she displayed when discussing how to strip another woman of her legal rights, her home, her name. He had admired this quality 18 months ago. He had called it strength. Now, for the first time, he wondered whether it was something else entirely. "There is something I need to ask you," he said, "and I need the answer to be true." Celeste's expression flickered, a micro-shift, the kind of change that happens behind the eyes when someone recalculates which version of themselves to present. "Ask." "The Arden family's military contracts, the ones that elevated your house from minor lords to parliamentary influence over the past decade, who brokered those contracts?" "My father." "Who approved them?" "The Dominion Military Authority." "Your authority." "I approved contracts for 11 noble houses during that period. I remember 9 of them. 2 were flagged by my military advisors as favorable terms that seemed inconsistent with the Arden family's strategic value at the time. I signed them because they came with endorsements from 3 separate parliamentary allies whose judgment I trusted." Celeste did not move. Her breathing did not change. But something in the quality of her stillness shifted, the way water shifts when the current beneath the surface reverses direction. "Those 3 allies," Alaric continued, "Lord Devereux, Sir Marcus Hale, and Viscount Enerly. All 3 have since voted against Blackthorne initiatives in Parliament. All 3 have financial connections to houses that compete directly with my territorial interests." "What exactly are you asking me, Alaric?" "I'm asking whether the woman who shares my bed spent the last 18 months positioning herself for exactly this moment. The same way my wife apparently spent 5 years positioning herself. I am asking whether I am surrounded by strategists, and I am the only one in this castle who has been playing the game blind." Celeste rose from her chair. She moved to the map wall and stood with her back to him, studying the terrain the way she always did when she needed time to construct her response. "Every person in this empire positions themselves," she said. "Every noble, every merchant, every servant who pours your wine and remembers your preferences. Positioning is not betrayal. It is survival. You taught me that." "I did not teach you anything. We have known each other 18 months. You taught everyone. Every time you crushed a rival, every time you bought a vote, every time you stood in this room and moved pieces across a map like they were not human beings with their own ambitions. You taught every person in Valamir that the only way to survive near power is to build your own. She turned to face him. Her eyes were dry. Her voice was steady. And in the torchlight of the war room, for the first time since he had taken her into his bed, Alaric saw Celeste Arden clearly. Not the passion he had projected onto her. Not the future he had imagined with her. The actual woman. Intelligent, calculating, ambitious, and utterly transparent in her hunger for the position she had been angling toward since the night they met. He had mistaken her for an ally. She was a mirror. She reflected back to him exactly what he was, and he had been too vain to recognize his own reflection. "Get out," he said quietly. Celeste studied his face for 3 seconds. Then she picked up her composure the way a soldier picks up a dropped weapon, smoothly, without breaking stride, and walked to the door. She paused in the doorway. "The council meets in 3 weeks. Whatever you think of me, the strategy is sound. If you do not secure the ratification vote, Seraphine will dismantle everything you have built, not because she hates you, but because you gave her no reason not to." She left. Alaric sat in the war room until the candles burned to stubs and the maps on the walls disappeared into darkness. He sat with the weight of a question he had never once asked during 12 years of ruling the most powerful dominion in Valamir. What did he actually build? Not the silver mines. Those existed before him, not the trade routes. Those belonged to the Delacourt charters, not the military funding. That belonged to agreements he did not control, not the political alliances. Those were dissolving around him like salt in water. He built a reputation. He built fear. He built the illusion of ownership over systems that continued to function not because of his command, but because a quiet woman in the East Wing made sure they did. The candles died. The war room went dark. And somewhere in that darkness, Duke Alaric Voss confronted the most dangerous enemy he had ever faced, the possibility that he was not the man he believed himself to be. On the 14th day after the ball, Seraphine convened her own meeting, not in the war room, not in the Great Hall. In the East Wing Library, a modest chamber lined with books that 3 generations of Delacourt women had collected and that no one in the Voss family had ever opened. 12 people attended. Sir Brennan Lockwood, military financier. Governor Harlan of the Eastern Reaches. 3 merchant guild masters whose trade networks collectively moved more goods through Valamir than the Imperial Navy. 2 judicial authorities. And 5 provincial administrators who controlled the daily operations of territories Alaric believed he governed. Seraphine sat at the head of a table that had never hosted a meeting of political consequence in its existence. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her voice carried no triumph, no satisfaction, no hint that the woman speaking had just spent 2 weeks methodically dismantling the operational infrastructure of the most powerful dominion in the empire. "I want to be clear about what this meeting is and what it is not. This is not a coup. This is not a rebellion. And this is not revenge." She looked at each face around the table, 12 people who had quietly answered her letters, honored her requests, and repositioned their loyalties based on relationships she had built over years of patient, invisible work. "This is a correction," she said. "The Dominion of Blackthorne has operated for over a decade on a structural imbalance. Military expansion funded by trade systems it does not legally control. Political influence sustained by economic networks it has never acknowledged. My husband built an empire on foundations that belonged to my family. I did not object because, for a long time, the arrangement served the stability of the Dominion. It does not serve it any longer." Lockwood leaned forward. He was a square-jawed man in his 50s whose fortune had been built on the simple principle that armies need money and money needs security. "What do you want, Duchess?" Seraphine folded her hands on the table. The gesture was simple, controlled. The hands of a woman who had learned that the most powerful position in any room is the one that does not need to perform its power. "I want the Duke to appear before the Imperial Council and formally acknowledge the Delacourt charter system as the legal foundation of Blackthorne's economic operations. I want joint governance authority over trade and financial policy, and I want Lady Celeste Arden removed from any position of influence within the Dominion." "And if he refuses?" Seraphine looked at Lockwood with an expression that answered his question before her words did. Then I dissolve the charters, all 17, and the Dominion of Blackthorne becomes the most heavily armed territory in the Empire with no economy to sustain it. The room was silent. Governor Harlan spoke next. The council meets in 7 days. Voss has been visiting estates, trying to secure ratification votes for the dissolution. He has commitments from 4 houses, possibly 5. He needs 12, Seraphine said. He will not get them. Not because those houses oppose him, because those houses have already received my terms for continued trade access. Supporting a dissolution that removes the charter holder from the Dominion is not in their financial interest. You have been busy, Lockwood said. There was something in his voice that might have been admiration or fear. In the upper reaches of Valamir's power structure, the two were often indistinguishable. I have been patient, Seraphine corrected. There is a difference. The meeting lasted 2 hours. When it ended, 12 people left the East Wing Library carrying an understanding of the Dominion's true power structure that most of the Empire's leadership still lacked. They carried something else as well. The knowledge that the quiet Duchess they had overlooked for 5 years had not merely survived her husband's public humiliation. She had converted it into the most precise political instrument any of them had ever seen. That same evening, a rider arrived at Blackthorne from Lord Pemberton's estate. Not for Alaric, for Celeste. The message was short. Pemberton was willing to discuss an alliance, not with the Duke, with the Arden family directly. He had information about the Delacourt charter system that he believed Celeste would find valuable. Information that could, in Pemberton's carefully chosen words, shift the balance of the current dispute decisively. Celeste read the message in her quarters. She read it twice. Then she locked the door, lit a fresh candle, and began composing a response that she did not mention to Alaric. Outside her window, the mountains of Blackthorne stood black against a winter sky that offered no stars. Somewhere below, in the bowels of the castle, the daily machinery of the Dominion ground forward on systems and structures that were quietly, methodically being redirected by hands that had finally stopped waiting for permission. And in the East Wing, at the writing desk that had witnessed 3 generations of Delacourt women building the invisible architecture of an empire, Seraphine opened her final drawer. Inside lay a single document. It was not a letter, not a charter, not a legal filing. It was a complete financial audit of the Arden family's holdings, conducted quietly over the previous 14 months, documenting every contract, every payment, every covert transaction that connected Celeste's house to a network of nobles who had spent the last decade systematically weakening Blackthorne from within. Seraphine had not been preparing for the ball. She had been preparing for what came after, and what came after was already here. Celeste's rider left Blackthorne before dawn. She watched from the West Wing corridor as the horse disappeared into the gray line where the mountain road met the tree line, carrying her sealed response to Lord Pemberton. The castle was still sleeping. The servants who moved through the lower corridors at this hour were kitchen staff and stable hands, people whose existence registered in Celeste's awareness approximately the way furniture registered, present, functional, beneath consideration. She had not told Alaric about Pemberton's message. She had not told Alaric about many things. This was not, in Celeste's internal calculation, dishonesty. It was operational independence, a concept Alaric himself had taught her through 12 years of example, though he would never have recognized the lesson if someone had named it for him. Every powerful person she had ever observed operated on the same principle. Share enough information to maintain the appearance of partnership. Withhold enough to maintain the reality of leverage. The balance between those two quantities was the actual definition of control, and Celeste Arden had been balancing them since the age of 16, when her father first sat her down in the family's modest estate library and explained without sentiment what it meant to be born into a minor noble house with major ambitions. You will be beautiful, he had said. That is useful. But beauty is a depreciating asset. Intelligence compounds. Learn the difference before the market does. She had learned. And now, standing in the cold corridor of a castle that should have been hers by this point in the campaign, she was calculating whether the market had already moved beyond her position. Pemberton's message suggested he possessed information about the Delacourt charter system, information that could shift the balance. Those were careful words from a careful man, and Celeste understood careful men the way surgeons understand anatomy, by knowing exactly where the vital structures lay and how much pressure each one could withstand before something ruptured. If Pemberton genuinely held information that could neutralize Seraphine's charter leverage, the entire political equation changed. Alaric would not need the ratification vote. He would not need the noble houses currently hiding behind non-committal letters and closed gates. He would need only the legal mechanism to invalidate the charters, and then the Dominion's infrastructure would revert to its default state, controlled by whoever sat in the Duke's chair. And if Celeste had been the one to secure that mechanism, her position beside the chair became permanent. She returned to her quarters. The candle she had lit the night before had burned down to a stub. She lit another. The small flame caught the silver pins in her hair and threw fragments of light across the stone walls like scattered coins. She began composing her second letter of the morning. This one was not addressed to Pemberton. It was addressed to Viscount Enerly. 4 days before the Imperial Council convened, Alaric returned from his tour of the noble estates with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 10 days projecting strength while the ground beneath his feet turned to sand. He had visited 11 houses. He had secured commitments from 5. 2 definitive, 3 conditional. The conditional lords wanted guarantees, trade access, military contracts, parliamentary support for their own territorial disputes. The currency of politics, traded at a markup that reflected exactly how much Alaric's position had deteriorated since the ball. The remaining 6 houses had been variations of the same performance: elaborate meals, careful conversation, and the unmistakable body language of powerful men who had already decided which way the wind was blowing and were simply too polite to say it to his face. Halleck met him at the castle gates with a list of developments that had accumulated during his absence. The list was not encouraging. 3 more trade routes had been rerouted. The silver processing contracts for the mountain mines had been placed under review by the merchant guild that operated the smelting facilities, a guild whose charter authority traced back to the Delacourt trade network. And the Imperial Council's administrative office had received a formal petition from Duchess Seraphine Voss requesting a special session to address what the petition called structural governance concerns within the Dominion of Blackthorne. She petitioned the council? Alaric's boots were still muddy from the road. He had not changed. He had not eaten. He stood in the entrance hall of his own castle reading documents that described the systematic disassembly of his authority, and his jaw worked with the unconscious rhythm of a man grinding his teeth against words he refused to let escape. 3 days ago, my lord, the petition was countersigned by Sir Brennan Lockwood and Governor Harlan. Lockwood and Harlan, both of them. Yes, my lord. Alaric looked at the documents in his hands. Then he looked at the entrance hall around him, the ancient stone, the vaulted ceiling, the Voss banners hanging from iron brackets that had held the family crest for 2 centuries. Everything in this castle had been designed to project permanence, to say, in the language of architecture and heraldry, that the family who held these walls would hold them forever. Permanence, he was learning, was an aesthetic choice, not a structural guarantee. Where is Celeste? Halleck's hesitation was so brief that a less attentive man would have missed it. Alaric was many things, but inattentive was not among them. Not anymore. The Lady Celeste departed 2 days ago, my lord. She indicated she had personal business at the Arden estate and would return before the council session. Personal business. Those were her words, my lord. Alaric set down the documents. He walked past Halleck without another word, through the entrance hall, up the main staircase, down the corridor that led to the west wing, to Celeste's quarters. The rooms were empty, not stripped empty, lived in empty. Clothes in the wardrobe, perfume on the vanity, books on the side table, left open at pages she would presumably return to finish, everything arranged to suggest a brief departure with every intention of return. But the writing desk was clean, completely clean. No letters, no documents, no correspondence of any kind. The drawers were empty. The inkwell had been rinsed. A woman leaving for personal business at a family estate does not clean her writing desk. She cleans her writing desk when she does not want anyone reading what she has been writing. Alaric stood in the empty room and felt something shift in the architecture of his understanding. Not a crack. Something deeper. The kind of structural failure that happens when a building has been settling for years and the occupant has been ignoring the sound because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that the foundation was never sound to begin with. He had chosen Celeste because she was everything Seraphine was not. Now he was beginning to understand what that actually meant. Seraphine learned of Celeste's departure from Marjorie, who had learned it from the kitchen staff, who had learned it from the stable master who saddled the horses. Information in Blackthorne moved through the servant network the way water moves through limestone, slowly, invisibly, and into every crevice. 2 days ago, Seraphine repeated. She was seated at her writing desk, but for once, she was not writing. She was reading. The financial audit of the Arden family's holdings lay spread across the desk surface, 43 pages of transactions, contracts, and covert financial arrangements compiled over 14 months of patient investigation. 2 days ago, and her destination was the Arden estate. That is what the stable master reported, my lady. The Arden estate is a day's ride east, but Lord Pemberton's estate is half a day's ride south of the Arden property, and Viscount Enerly's holdings are 2 hours beyond Pemberton's. Marjorie said nothing. She had been Seraphine's lady-in-waiting for 4 years, and had learned that her mistress did not share observations to invite commentary. She shared them to make the shape of her thinking visible, the way an architect sketches lines on paper, not to ask whether the building should exist, but to see how the structure fits together. Seraphine set down the audit pages and looked at the wall opposite her desk. The wall held a single painting, a landscape of the Ashenvale Mountains rendered in the muted colors of a winter morning. Her grandmother had commissioned it 60 years ago, not because the mountains were beautiful, though they were, because the painting contained, hidden in the geological detail of the rock formations, a visual map of the original silver vein positions that the Delacourt family had charted before the Voss dynasty ever set foot in the region. Her grandmother had understood something that every generation of Delacourt women learned eventually. The most valuable information is the kind that hides in plain sight, overlooked by people who believe they already understand what they are looking at. Marjorie, I need you to send a message to Governor Harlan, quietly. Use the kitchen passage, not the main corridor. What should the message say, my lady? Tell him to pull the Arden family's parliamentary voting records for the last decade. Every vote, every abstention, every proxy delegation. I want the complete record on my desk before the council meets. Yes, my lady. And Marjorie, one more thing. My lady? Send a separate message to Lockwood. Tell him that the compliance review on the military lending agreements should proceed to the next phase, full disclosure of all subordinate financial instruments tied to the Blackthorne military apparatus. Full disclosure. Every contract, every side agreement, every private arrangement between the military command structure and any noble house that has done business with the Dominion's armed forces in the last 10 years. Marjorie paused. She was not a political woman. She did not understand the specifics of charter law or military finance, but she understood scale, and the scope of what Seraphine was requesting was large enough to change the texture of the air in the room. My lady, that would include the Arden family's military contracts. Yes, all of them. Marjorie left. Seraphine sat alone with the audit and the painting and the weight of what she was about to do. She had spent 5 years building this position, 5 years of silence and patience, and the slow, invisible accumulation of relationships that no one in the Dominion thought to monitor because no one believed she was capable of strategy. But the strategy was never about power. Not really. Power was the mechanism. The objective was something more fundamental. It was the need to make visible what had been hidden, to pull the architecture of this empire out of the shadows, and lay it on the table where everyone could see whose hands had actually been holding it together. And now, 3 days before the Imperial Council, she was about to discover whether the architecture she had built was strong enough to withstand what she suspected was coming, because Celeste Arden was not running. Celeste Arden was maneuvering. And a woman who maneuvers when she should be retreating is a woman who believes she still holds a weapon no one else has seen. The council chamber of the Imperial Palace occupied the entire second floor of Valamir's seat of government, a building designed to make every person who entered it feel simultaneously important and insignificant. Marble columns lined the approach. The ceiling depicted military victories from 3 centuries of imperial expansion, painted in the dramatic style of artists who understood that their patrons wanted to see themselves reflected in the faces of conquerors. Alaric arrived on the morning of the council session wearing the formal military dress of the Blackthorne Dominion, black coat with silver threading, the Voss crest embroidered across the left breast, boots polished to a reflective finish. He looked like what he was, the most powerful military commander in the empire, a man whose name had been synonymous with authority for 12 years. He also looked, to anyone who knew him well enough to read the signs, like a man who had not slept in several days and was managing the deficit through force of will alone. Seraphine arrived separately. She wore deep blue, a color she had never worn publicly during her marriage, a deliberate departure from the emerald and ivory palette that Alaric's household staff had selected for her since the wedding. The blue was her mother's color, the Delacourt color, and every noble in the chamber who understood heraldic signaling understood exactly what the choice communicated. She was no longer dressing as a Voss. The chamber filled, 23 noble houses represented, 6 military commanders, 4 foreign delegations, 2 imperial magistrates, the full weight of Valamir's governing apparatus assembled in a room built to contain exactly this kind of concentrated ambition. Celeste was not present. Alaric noticed her absence the moment he entered. He scanned the chamber with the automatic threat assessment of a man trained to identify missing pieces before identifying present ones. Her seat in the Arden family's section was empty. The Arden family's steward occupied the adjacent chair, a thin-faced man whose presence suggested that the family intended to be represented even if its most prominent member did not personally attend. Something cold settled in Alaric's chest. Not panic. Alaric Voss did not panic. But the animal part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive on battlefields and in political chambers for 2 decades, recognized the pattern. A missing ally at a critical moment was never accidental. It was either a retreat or a flanking maneuver, and the difference between the two could determine whether you survived the next hour. The session opened with procedural business that nobody cared about. Trade regulations, border disputes, the kind of administrative machinery that empires generate to convince themselves they are governed by systems rather than by the men who control them. Then the speaker called the special petition. Seraphine rose. The chamber adjusted. Not dramatically. There was no gasp, no theatrical silence, but the quality of attention shifted. 300 people simultaneously stopped performing their interest and started genuinely paying attention, and the difference between those two states was the difference between watching a play and watching a fire. "My lords, commanders, and honored delegates," Seraphine began. Her voice did not fill the chamber the way Alaric's did. It did not need to. In a room designed for projection and performance, the quiet voice was the one that made people lean forward. "I am here to address a structural matter concerning the governance of the Dominion of Blackthorne. This is not a personal grievance. This is an institutional correction." She presented the charter documentation first. 17 trade charters, each one displayed in its original parchment form, each one bearing the Delacourt family seal and the legal registration that established its authority under merchant law. She walked the council through the history efficiently, without embellishment. The charters predated the Voss dynasty's claim on Blackthorne. They had been brought into the Dominion through her family's marriage alliance. Their legal status had never been transferred, reclassified, or formally incorporated into Blackthorne's governance structure. "The Dominion of Blackthorne operates on economic infrastructure it does not legally control," Seraphine said. "This is not an accusation. It is a fact. And facts, unlike political alliances, do not change based on who finds them convenient." Alaric sat rigid in his chair. He watched his wife dismantle the legal foundation of his dominion with the same methodical precision she brought to everything she did, calm, thorough, and completely devoid of the dramatic flair that would have given him something to counter. Drama he could fight. Facts required a different weapon, and he was not certain he possessed it. Then Seraphine shifted. "However, the charter question is not the most urgent matter before this council." The room recalibrated again. A second shift in a presentation that the audience had assumed was building toward a single point. "Over the past 14 months, I have conducted a financial audit of the Arden family's holdings and their connections to the Blackthorne Dominion." Alaric's hands tightened on the armrests of his chair. "The audit reveals a pattern, of coordinated financial manipulation spanning the last decade. Military contracts awarded to the Arden family at terms significantly below market standard. Parliamentary votes influenced through covert payments routed through 3 intermediary houses. And a systematic campaign to redirect Blackthorne's military expansion toward territories whose conquest benefited not the Dominion, but a network of noble houses with private commercial interests in those regions. The chamber was absolutely silent now, not the performative silence of protocol. The genuine silence of 300 people holding their breath. The Arden family did not rise to prominence through merit or strategic marriage alone. They rose through the deliberate manipulation of the Duke of Blackthorne's military and political decisions, conducted over 10 years by individuals who had access to the Dominion's inner operations. Seraphine paused. She looked directly at the Arden family steward, who had gone the color of old parchment. Lady Celeste Arden's relationship with Duke Alaric Voss was not incidental. It was the final phase of a campaign designed to place an Arden representative at the center of Blackthorne's decision-making structure, with the ultimate objective of securing legal control over Dominion assets through the dissolution of the Duke's current marriage. The words hit the chamber like a physical force. Nobles turned to look at Alaric. Military commanders exchanged glances that contained entire strategic reassessments. Ambassador Dreykov leaned forward in his chair with the focused intensity of a man watching a foreign power collapse in real time and taking notes for his government. Alaric did not move. He did not speak. He sat in his chair in the formal military dress of the Blackthorne Dominion and absorbed the revelation that the woman he had chosen to replace his wife had been chosen for him, selected and positioned and maneuvered into his bed by people who understood his weaknesses better than he did. His vanity, his hunger for admiration, his absolute certainty that he was the one doing the choosing. The animal part of his brain was screaming now, not in fear, in recognition. The recognition that comes when a predator realizes it has been prey all along, that the territory it believed it was hunting through was actually a trap designed by something that understood its patterns better than it understood itself. Seraphine continued. She presented the financial evidence, contracts with dates, amounts, and signatures, payment records showing transfers between the Arden family and 3 noble houses whose parliamentary votes had consistently supported policies that weakened Blackthorne while appearing to strengthen it. Correspondence between Celeste and Viscount Ennerly that predated her arrival at Blackthorne by 2 years, documenting a strategy to infiltrate the Dominion's power structure through what the letters called personal access to the Duke. Personal access. The clinical language of an operation that reduced Alaric's emotional life to an attack vector. The Arden family steward stood and left the chamber. He did not ask permission. He did not offer explanation. He simply walked out, and the door closing behind him was the loudest sound in the room. Alaric became aware that his breathing had changed. Shallow, rapid, the breathing of a man whose body had registered a threat that his mind was still processing. He forced himself to inhale, hold, exhale. The combat breathing pattern, the technique he had used on battlefields to keep his hands steady and his vision clear when the killing started. He was using battlefield survival techniques in a council chamber, against evidence presented by his own wife, about the woman he had publicly declared his future. The irony was so precise it felt surgical. Seraphine finished her presentation. She gathered her documents. She stood before the Imperial Council with the composed bearing of a woman who had just detonated the political landscape of the most powerful dominion in the Empire, and felt nothing about it that she could not control. "I am not asking this council to punish anyone," she said. "I'm asking this council to see clearly. The Dominion of Blackthorne requires governance reform. Its economic foundation must be legally recognized and properly administered, and the individuals who manipulated its leadership for personal gain must be removed from any position of influence." She sat down. The speaker called a recess. The chamber erupted into the controlled chaos of 300 people simultaneously realizing that everything they thought they understood about the power structure of Valamir's largest dominion was wrong. Alaric did not participate in the chaos. He sat in his chair while nobles and commanders and ambassadors swirled around him, and he felt the particular isolation of a man who has been publicly stripped of the narrative he built his identity on. Not his title, not his lands, not his military rank, his narrative, the story he told himself about who he was, The conqueror, the builder, the man who controlled everything he touched. That man had been manufactured, shaped and steered by people who understood that the easiest person to manipulate is the one who believes he is immune to manipulation. He stood. The movement silenced the people nearest to him, the way sudden motion from a large predator silences everything in its immediate radius. He walked to Seraphine. She looked up at him. Her face carried no triumph, no satisfaction, no contempt. It carried the steady, watchful expression of a woman who had just done something enormous and was waiting to see what it produced. "How long did you know?" His voice was low, rough. The voice of a man speaking through damage he had not yet learned to calculate. "About the Ardennes conspiracy?" 14 months. "And you did not tell me." "You would not have believed me. 14 months ago you were sharing your bed with the woman running the operation. What evidence could I have presented that you would not have dismissed as jealousy?" The question landed with the weight of truth. Because she was right. 14 months ago, he would have listened to Seraphine's evidence the way he listened to everything she said, with the patient, empty tolerance of a man who had already decided that nothing coming from her direction could possibly matter. "I need to see the full audit," he said. "It is in my quarters. You are welcome to read it." "And the Ardennes correspondence, the letters between Celeste and Ennerly?" "Those as well." He looked at her, really looked, maybe for the first time in 5 years of marriage. Not at the decorative surface he had married for political convenience. Not at the silent ghost he had ignored because her silence was easier to manage than engagement. At the actual woman. The strategist who had mapped his empire's weaknesses from the inside while he strutted across its surface. The architect who had built relationships with every load-bearing pillar of his dominion while he was busy conquering territories that someone else chose for him. "You saved Blackthorne," he said. The words came out like something pulled from deep tissue, painful, necessary. "I have not saved anything yet," Seraphine said. "Celeste is not at this council, which means she knows the audit is coming, which means she is not at the Ardennes estate conducting personal business. She is somewhere else, doing something that she believes will still salvage her position. What could she possibly do at this point? The same thing any cornered strategist does. She is going to try to take by force what she can no longer take by manipulation." Alaric felt the cold in his chest again, sharper now, closer to the bone. "Blackthorne," he said. Seraphine nodded. "We are standing in the Imperial Palace. The council session will continue for at least 2 more days. Every major military commander in the Dominion is in this building. And Blackthorne Castle is defended by a garrison whose officers have been receiving Arden family military contracts for the better part of a decade." The magnitude of it hit him the way artillery hits a wall. Not all at once, in waves, each one revealing more of the damage than the last. Celeste had not fled. She had redeployed. While Seraphine presented the audit to the council, and Alaric sat absorbing the evidence of his own manipulation, Celeste and whatever allies she had left were moving toward the one asset that still mattered. The physical seat of power, the castle itself, the ancient fortress carved into the mountains that held the silver and the forests and the infrastructure of an empire that was, at this exact moment, more vulnerable than it had been in 200 years. Alaric looked at Seraphine and saw in her eyes the same calculation he was performing, the same tactical assessment, the same understanding that the chess game they had been playing with paper and politics was about to become something older, something that solved disputes with steel instead of seals. "I need to get back to Blackthorne," he said. "We need to get back to Blackthorne," she corrected. It was such a small word. "We." 3 letters. But standing in the council chamber of the Imperial Palace, surrounded by the wreckage of every assumption he had built his life on, Alaric heard in that word something he had spent 12 years of command and 5 years of marriage never once hearing from anyone around him. Not deference, not obedience, not the performative loyalty of people who followed him because the alternative was worse. Partnership. And he did not know what to do with it. He did not know how to hold something that was offered rather than taken, how to stand beside a force he could not control or command or own. Every instinct in his body screamed to seize, to direct, to convert this woman's strength into a resource he could deploy. But those instincts were the ones that had delivered him here, to this chamber, to this moment, to the wreckage of a life built on the certainty that possession was the highest form of power. The man he had been would have given orders. The man he needed to become would have to do something far more difficult. He would have to follow. "Tell me what you need," he said. And Seraphine, who had spent 5 years waiting for exactly those words, looked at the Duke of Blackthorne and began. They rode through the night. Seraphine had arranged the horses before the council session ended, which meant she had anticipated this outcome before Alaric had finished processing it. 2 mounts from the Imperial Palace stables, fast and conditioned for mountain roads. A 3rd horse carried Marjorie, who refused to stay behind with a quiet stubbornness that Alaric was beginning to recognize as a Delacourt family trait. No escort, no soldiers, no banner-carrying retinue announcing the Duke's movement across his own territory. Seraphine had been explicit about this. If the garrison officers at Blackthorne are compromised, a military escort announces our approach. We arrive to locked gates and whatever story Celeste has prepared. If we travel light, we arrive before anyone expects us. Alaric had not argued. The man who would have argued, the man who traveled nowhere without an armed column, because the display of force was itself a political statement, that man was still sitting in the council chamber absorbing the dimensions of his own stupidity. The man on horseback now was something rawer, stripped down to instinct, operating on the animal logic that takes over when the civilized machinery of status and strategy has been pulled out from underneath you. The mountain road from the Imperial Palace to Blackthorne was a 7-hour ride in daylight. At night, with winter wind cutting across exposed ridgelines and the road surface visible only where moonlight broke through cloud cover, it was closer to 10. They did not speak for the first 3 hours. Alaric rode slightly ahead, not from chivalry or tactical positioning, but from the simple inability to look at Seraphine for sustained periods without confronting emotions he had no framework to process. Shame was part of it. Not the performative shame of a man caught in a public mistake, but the structural kind. The kind that reaches into the load-bearing walls of your identity and asks whether anything you built on them was ever real. She had known about Celeste for 14 months. She had watched him parade his mistress through the halls of Blackthorne, watched him seat Celeste at public functions where Seraphine was pushed to the margins, watched him announce Celeste as the true Duchess before 300 people who turned to Seraphine expecting devastation and found instead a smile. That smile. He understood it now. It was not composure. It was not dignity. It was the expression of a woman who had already won the war watching her opponent celebrate a battle that did not matter. And he had been too drunk on his own authority to read it. The horses climbed, the air thinned, the temperature dropped until Alaric could feel it in his knuckles and his jaw. He welcomed the cold the way he had always welcomed physical discomfort, as proof that his body was still functioning even when the rest of him felt like wreckage. Around the 4th hour, Seraphine pulled alongside him on a stretch of road wide enough for 2 horses. "There are things you need to know before we arrive. Tell me." The garrison at Blackthorne consists of 400 soldiers. The commanding officer is Captain Rendell. He received his commission 3 years ago through a recommendation that came from Lord Devereux's office. Devereux? One of the 3 parliamentary allies who endorsed the Arden military contracts. Yes. So Rendell is Arden's man. Rendell is whoever is paying him. Right now, that is the Dominion Treasury, which means you. But if Celeste has reached Blackthorne before us and offered him a different arrangement, his loyalty is a market question, not a moral one. Alaric absorbed this. The horse beneath him moved with the steady rhythm of an animal that did not care about political conspiracies or crumbling empires. It cared about the road, about the next step, about the simple mechanical reality of forward motion. He envied it. What else? The castle's internal security is managed by Halleck's staff, 40 household guards. Most of them have served Blackthorne for years and have no connection to the Arden network. But household guards are not soldiers. If Rendell's garrison moves against us, 40 men with ceremonial weapons will not hold them. So we need to reach the castle before Celeste can turn the garrison. We need to reach the castle before Celeste can convince Rendell that turning the garrison is in his financial interest. There is a difference. A coup requires more than soldiers. It requires a narrative, a reason for the soldiers to believe that what they are doing is legitimate rather than treasonous. What narrative could she possibly construct? Seraphine looked at him. In the moonlight, her face was stripped of the careful composure she wore in daylight. What remained was harder, more angular. The face of a woman who had been running calculations about catastrophic scenarios for longer than he wanted to know. She will tell them you have been deposed, that the Imperial Council voted to remove you, that she is acting under parliamentary authority to secure the Dominion during the transition. By the time anyone verifies the claim, she only needs 48 hours inside the castle walls to consolidate her position. The Council did not vote to remove me. Does Captain Rendell know that? He is sitting in a mountain fortress with 400 soldiers and limited communication with the capital. If a woman he has been taking orders from for 3 years arrives and tells him the Duke has fallen, what is he going to do? Send a rider on a 7-hour journey to verify while the political situation resolves itself around him? Alaric said nothing. He had spent 12 years commanding soldiers. He knew exactly what a garrison commander would do when faced with conflicting authority and limited information. He would choose the authority that was physically present. The authority standing in front of him with orders and confidence and the implicit promise that compliance would be rewarded. Celeste would be very, very good at that promise. How far ahead of us is she? She left Blackthorne 2 days before the council session. If she went to the Arden estate first and then redirected to the castle, she has approximately a 12-hour lead. 12 hours is enough to take a castle. 12 hours is enough to take a castle if the person taking it understands the castle. Celeste knows the political structure. She knows the military command chain. She knows the layout of the West Wing and the Great Hall and every room she has occupied for the last 18 months. But she does not know the East Wing. She does not know the servant passages. She does not know the kitchen corridors or the storage tunnels or the underground route that connects the old Delacourt wine cellars to the lower gatehouse. Alaric looked at her. There is an underground route to the gatehouse. My grandmother built it. During the Civil War 60 years ago, when the castle was under siege and the Delacourt family needed a way to move supplies without being seen. You have a secret entrance to my castle. I have a secret entrance to my family's castle. The Voss dynasty has occupied it for 2 centuries. The Delacourts built it. The correction was precise, and it carried the kind of weight that rearranges how a man understands the ground beneath his feet. His castle. He had called it his castle for 12 years. Before that, his father had called it his castle. Before that, his grandfather. 3 generations of Voss men standing on Delacourt foundations and never once looking down. They rode on. The mountains grew around them. The road narrowed. The trees thickened until the moonlight came through in fragments, broken by branches that reached across the path like arms trying to hold back whatever was coming through. By the 6th hour, Alaric could feel the exhaustion in his shoulders and his lower back and the muscles of his thighs where they gripped the saddle. He had not slept in 2 days. He had not eaten since the morning before the council session. His body was running on the reserves that combat training builds into the nervous system, the deep fuel that soldiers learn to access when everything above it has been burned through. But the exhaustion was useful. It stripped away the layers of performance and strategy and ego that normally insulated him from the raw mechanics of his own thinking. Underneath those layers, in the place where instinct lived before civilization covered it over, he could feel something that was not fear and was not anger and was not the calculated aggression that had carried him through every crisis of his adult life. It was clarity, the kind of clarity that comes only when every comfortable lie has been removed and you are left standing in the actual architecture of your life, seeing it for the first time without the decorative facades you spent years building over the structural failures. He had married a woman for political convenience and ignored her for 5 years because her silence was easier to manage than her competence. He had taken a mistress who reflected his own vanity back at him and called it passion. He had built an empire on foundations he did not own, commanded loyalty he had not earned, and projected authority over systems he did not understand. And now he was riding through darkness toward a castle that might already be held by enemies, beside a woman who had every reason to let him ride alone. But she was here. That fact was harder to process than all the others combined. They reached the lower approach to Blackthorne at dawn. The castle sat above them on the mountain, its black towers cutting the pale sky like teeth. From this distance, it looked the same as it always had. Permanent. Impregnable. The physical embodiment of power that does not negotiate. But Seraphine pointed to the gate. The banner configuration has changed. Alaric looked. The main gate flew the Voss crest, as always. But the positioning was wrong. Standard protocol placed the Duke's personal banner on the highest flagpole, with the Dominion banner below it and the Imperial standard to the right. What he saw now was the Dominion banner at the top, the Imperial standard in the center, and no personal banner at all. Rendell removed your personal flag, Seraphine said. He is signaling that the castle operates under Dominion authority, not personal authority. It is the configuration used during a transition of governance. She got here first. She got here first. Alaric dismounted. His legs protested the sudden change from riding to standing, the muscles cramped from 10 hours in the saddle. He ignored them the way he ignored all physical complaints, by redirecting his attention to the tactical problem in front of him. The gatehouse tunnel. How large? Wide enough for 2 people. It exits in the lower storage level, beneath the kitchen wing. And from the kitchen wing we can reach what? Everything. The servant passages connect every section of the castle. They were designed to be invisible to the aristocratic residents, which means Celeste does not know they exist. Marjorie had dismounted behind them. She stood holding the reins of 3 exhausted horses with the particular calm of a woman who had decided that fear was not a productive use of her limited energy. My lady, I can enter through the tunnel first. If there are guards posted in the lower level, a servant will not attract the same attention as the Duchess. Seraphine looked at her lady-in-waiting. Marjorie, this is not your fight. I have served you for 4 years. Everything you built while I opened doors, carried letters, and kept your secrets. If someone is going to take this castle from you, they are going to have to walk past me to do it. The words were simple, delivered without the rhetorical polish of noble speech or the dramatic weight of a political declaration. They were the words of a woman who had chosen her side not because of political calculation or financial incentive, but because loyalty, the genuine kind, the kind that survives when every other structure collapses, is the only currency that cannot be manipulated. Alaric watched this exchange and felt something crack open in his chest. Not the sharp fracture of a single revelation, but the slow structural failure of an assumption he had carried for so long it had become invisible. He had believed that loyalty was purchased, that it flowed downward from power, extracted through authority, and maintained through the implicit threat that disloyalty would be punished. Marjorie was not loyal to Seraphine because of power. She was loyal because of something Alaric had never offered anyone in his life. Genuine care, consistent respect, the daily, unremarkable act of treating another human being as though their existence mattered beyond their utility. The tunnel entrance was hidden beneath a collapsed section of outer wall on the castle's north face, exactly where Seraphine said it would be. Alaric moved the stones that concealed the opening while Seraphine held a small lantern she had packed in her saddlebag. The tunnel was cold, narrow, and smelled of earth and old wine. The walls were rough-cut stone, the work of builders who cared about function over aesthetics. They moved single file. Marjorie first, then Seraphine, then Alaric. The tunnel descended for 30 yards before leveling out beneath the castle's foundation. The air grew warmer. Sounds began filtering through the stone above them. Footsteps, voices, the muffled percussion of a castle in operational mode. But the rhythm was wrong. Alaric had lived in Blackthorne for 12 years. He knew the sound of his castle the way a musician knows the sound of an instrument. The morning rhythm should have been kitchen staff and household guards, the quiet mechanical hum of domestic operation. What he heard instead was heavier, more frequent, boot steps on stone, the deliberate cadence of soldiers moving in formation through corridors designed for servants. The garrison is inside the castle, he whispered. Yes. All of them? Enough of them. They emerged in the lower storage level. Wine barrels and grain sacks lined the walls. The lantern threw long shadows that made the stored provisions look like crouching figures. Marjorie moved ahead, checking the corridor that connected the storage level to the kitchen wing. She returned in under a minute. 2 soldiers posted at the kitchen entrance. They are not household guards. Garrison regulars. Armed? Swords, no crossbows. Alaric looked at Seraphine. She looked back at him. In the dim light of the storage cellar, beneath the castle that both of their families had claimed and occupied and fought over for generations, they stood closer together than they had been at any point in 5 years of marriage. He could see the texture of exhaustion in her face, The shadows beneath her eyes, the tension in her jaw that came from riding 10 hours through mountain darkness toward a crisis she had anticipated but could not prevent. She was afraid. He could see it. Not the paralyzing fear that stops people in their tracks, but the sharp operational fear that accompanies the knowledge of exactly how badly things can go wrong. He was afraid too, and for the first time in his adult life, he did not treat the fear as a weakness to be suppressed. He treated it as information, a signal from the part of himself that understood, before his pride would admit it, that what he was about to do could cost him everything he had left. "I will handle the soldiers," he said. "Alaric, you are unarmed. I am the Duke of Blackthorne. Every soldier in that garrison swore an oath to me. Not to Celeste, not to Rendell, to me. Oaths are words. Swords are steel. Then I suppose we will find out which one is stronger." He moved before she could argue. Down the corridor, toward the kitchen entrance, toward the two garrison soldiers who stood with their hands on their weapons in a castle they had been told was no longer governed by the man walking toward them. They saw him. Both of them registered the same sequence of reactions: recognition, confusion, the rapid tactical assessment of soldiers confronting a situation their orders did not cover. "Stand down," Alaric said. His voice filled the corridor the way it filled every space he entered, not with volume, with density. The concentrated weight of a man who had commanded armies and broken enemy lines and walked through fields of the dead without flinching. "You are soldiers of Blackthorne. You answer to me. Whatever you have been told in my absence is a lie." The soldiers looked at each other. The older one, a man in his 30s with the weathered face of a career military officer, tightened his grip on his sword. The younger one took a step backward. "Captain Rendell gave orders, my lord. The castle is under transitional governance. No unauthorized entry." "I am not unauthorized. I am the Duke. This is my castle, and your captain is committing treason." The word landed in the corridor with physical force. Treason. The charge that turned soldiers into criminals and officers into corpses. It was the nuclear option of military authority, a word that made every man who heard it calculate, in the space between heartbeats, whether the path he was standing on led to a court-martial or a grave. The younger soldier lowered his weapon. The older one did not. "My lord, I have orders. I cannot—" "You can. You will. Because in 30 minutes, every noble house in the empire will know what happened here tonight. And when they do, every man who stood between me and my own door will be remembered, not as a soldier following orders, as a traitor who helped a foreign house steal the dominion of Blackthorne." The older soldier looked at Alaric. He looked at the corridor behind Alaric, where Seraphine had stepped into view, her blue dress visible in the lantern light, the delacourt colors unmistakable even in the underground passage of a besieged castle. He lowered his weapon. "My lord, where is Celeste?" "The Great Hall. She arrived yesterday with 12 men from the Arden estate. Captain Rendell placed the garrison under her operational command this morning." "How many soldiers support her?" "Maybe 200 actively. The rest are confused. Most of us did not understand the orders. We were told the Duke had been removed by the council." "I have not been removed. The council session is still in progress. Celeste lied to your captain, and your captain chose to believe her because it served his ambition." The soldier's jaw worked. The particular motion of a man who has just realized he picked the wrong side and is calculating how fast he can switch. "What do you want us to do, my lord?" "Find every soldier in this garrison who remembers who pays him. Tell them the Duke is home. Tell them to meet me in the armory, and tell them to bring their weapons." The soldier moved. Fast. The speed of a man with a clear order and a strong motivation to execute it correctly. Alaric turned to Seraphine. His face was cut with shadows and fatigue, and the particular rawness that comes from operating beyond the limits of endurance on nothing but will, and the sudden, startling discovery that will is not the same thing as strength. "The armory," he said. "How many of the household guard can we mobilize?" "Halleck will know. If he is still free." "Find him. Use the servant passages. Celeste does not know about them, and neither does Rendell. Move through the castle without being seen. Get Halleck. Get the household guard, and get me anything that proves the council did not authorize this takeover. I have the council petition documents, my copy, sealed and dated before the session began." "That will do. If Rendell sees official documentation proving Celeste fabricated the authorization, his position collapses. He is a career soldier, not an ideologue. He will not die for a lie once he knows it is one. Seraphine turned toward the servant passage. Then she stopped. Alaric. What? The Great Hall. If you go there now before we have enough soldiers to match the garrison, you are walking into a room full of armed men who have been told you are no longer their duke. Celeste will have prepared for this. She is many things, but she is not stupid. I know. Then you know that walking in there alone could get you killed. He looked at her. The woman he had married for political convenience. The woman he had ignored for 5 years. The woman who had spent those 5 years building the invisible architecture that kept his empire alive while he took credit for the skyline. 5 years ago, I walked into that great hall and declared myself the most powerful man in this empire. I believed it because nobody told me otherwise. Because I surrounded myself with people who reflected my own image back at me and called it loyalty. He paused. His breath was visible in the cold corridor air. His hands were steady, but his voice carried the rough grain of a man who was constructing something new from the wreckage of everything he had believed about himself. I'm going to walk into that hall again. Not because I am powerful, because if I do not, every soldier in this garrison who chose to believe Celeste's lie will have no reason to change his mind. They need to see me, standing in my own hall, refusing to give up the ground I should never have abandoned. He did not wait for her response. He moved into the servant passage and then up through the narrow corridors that threaded through the walls of Blackthorne like veins through a body, toward the great hall where Celeste Arden sat in a chair that was not hers, surrounded by soldiers whose loyalty she had purchased with a lie. Behind him, Seraphine watched him disappear into the walls of the castle. Then she moved in the opposite direction, toward Halleck, toward the household guard, toward the documentation that would strip Celeste's manufactured authority down to what it actually was. A performance, built on nothing, sustained by the willingness of frightened men to believe whatever story kept them safe. Seraphine knew something about performances. She had delivered one for 5 years. The difference between hers and Celeste's was simple. Hers had been built on truth, and truth, unlike power, does not require an audience to exist. The Great Hall of Blackthorne was lit for a ceremony that had never been authorized. Torches burned in every bracket. The long oak table that seated the Dominion's War Council had been moved to the center of the room. Maps and documents covered its surface. Captain Rendell stood at one end in full military dress, his hand resting on his sword hilt with the studied casualness of an officer who wanted to project confidence and was projecting anxiety instead. Celeste sat at the head of the table. She wore the silver dress she had worn to the Winter Ascension Ball, a deliberate choice designed to evoke the night Alaric had declared her the true Duchess. Her hair was pinned with the same silver ornaments. Her posture carried the same calculated elegance. But her eyes were different. The confident warmth she performed in public had been replaced by something colder, leaner. The eyes of a woman operating in territory beyond the reach of charm, where the only currencies that mattered were leverage and speed. 12 Arden men-at-arms lined the walls. Armed, alert. Their presence in the Great Hall was itself a violation of Dominion protocol. Private military forces had no authority inside the castle proper, but protocol was one of the first casualties of any power grab, and Celeste understood that once you have crossed the line, the only direction that offers survival is forward. The doors opened. Alaric walked in alone. The room reconfigured around his presence the way rooms always did. Not because he performed authority, though he did, because his body occupied space with the specific gravity of a man who had been trained since childhood to walk into hostile territory and make it submit. Celeste rose from the table. Her composure held, but Alaric had spent 18 months learning the micro-expressions that lived beneath her performance, and he caught it. A flicker in the muscles around her eyes, the fractional tightening of her jaw, the shift in breathing from controlled to managed. She had not expected him this soon. Alaric. She said his name the way she said everything, with precision, with the temperature carefully calibrated. The council session is not scheduled to conclude for 2 days. Your presence here is unexpected. My presence in my own castle is unexpected. Listen to what you just said, Celeste. This is a governance transition, authorized by the Imperial Council following the presentation of evidence against the Blackthorne leadership. Captain Rendell is acting under legitimate authority to secure the Dominion's assets during the transition period. No one authorized anything. I left the council chamber 6 hours into a recess. The session has not reconvened. No vote was taken. No transition was declared. Rendell shifted at the end of the table. The captain was a tall man, competent enough to manage a garrison in peacetime, not tested enough to navigate the kind of crisis that was currently filling the Great Hall with a tension thick enough to taste. My lord, Lady Celeste presented documentation. Lady Celeste presented a lie, and you believed it because believing it was easier than questioning it. Rendell's hand tightened on his sword hilt. The documents bore the imperial seal. Show me. Silence. The kind that has texture and weight, and the particular density of a room full of armed men realizing that the ground beneath their position might not be solid. Celeste spoke. The documentation is being verified through official channels. In the interim, this castle remains under transitional governance. There is no interim. There is no transition. There is a woman who lied to a garrison commander and a garrison commander who chose to believe her because she promised him something I had not. That is what is happening in this room. Everything else is theater. He stepped forward. Every ardent soldier along the wall adjusted, hands on weapons, weight shifting to the balls of their feet, the instinctive preparation of men trained to react to threat with force. Captain Rendell, Alaric's voice dropped, not to the whisper that his subordinates feared, lower, to the register that existed beneath performance, beneath strategy, beneath 12 years of practiced command, the voice of a man who had nothing left to project because everything he projected had already been stripped away. I am standing in the great hall of my ancestors. I am unarmed. I am alone. And I am telling you, as the Duke of Blackthorne, that the woman sitting at my table used you, the same way she used me, the same way she used every person in this dominion who was foolish enough to believe that what she offered was real. Rendell looked at Alaric. Then he looked at Celeste. Then he looked at the 12 ardent soldiers lining the walls of a castle that did not belong to them, in a hall they had no legal right to occupy, supporting a claim that rested on documents that no one in the room had actually verified. The captain was not a brave man, but he was not a stupid one either, and the calculation he was performing behind his eyes was the oldest equation in military history. The cost of loyalty versus the cost of treason, measured in years of imprisonment, loss of rank, and the probability that the side you chose would still be standing when the dust settled. Lady Celeste, Rendell said slowly, the Duke is requesting verification of the authorization documents. I would like to see the originals. Celeste's composure cracked, not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse that storytellers invent for moments of defeat. A hairline fracture that ran through the muscles of her face and the architecture of her posture, the kind of damage that is invisible from a distance and devastating up close. Captain, this is not the time for the originals, please. The great hall held its breath, and then the doors opened again. Seraphine entered from the east corridor. Behind her walked Halleck. Behind Halleck walked 32 household guards, each one carrying the weapons they had trained with for years in a castle, whose passages they knew better than any garrison soldier ever would. And in Seraphine's hand, held where every person in the great hall could see it, was the sealed council petition. Dated, stamped with the imperial administrative seal, bearing the notation that the session had been called to order, that a special petition had been heard, and that no vote of governance transition had been conducted or authorized. Proof. Physical, verifiable, undeniable proof that everything Celeste had told Captain Rendell was a fabrication. Celeste looked at the document. She looked at Seraphine. She looked at the 32 household guards who now outnumbered her 12 ardent soldiers almost 3-1. And for the first time since she had walked into Blackthorne 18 months ago with a strategy built on a decade of preparation, Lady Celeste Arden had no move left to make. Rendell drew his sword. Not against Alaric, he turned to face the ardent soldiers along the wall. Stand down, all of you. This castle is under the authority of Duke Alaric Voss. Anyone who disagrees can take it up with my garrison, which is currently assembling in the courtyard because a very motivated soldier told them the Duke was home. The Arden men looked at Celeste. She stood at the head of a table that was not hers, in a hall that was not hers, wearing the silver dress of a knight that had already become the most notorious scandal in the Empire's recent history. She did not give the order to stand down. She did not need to. Her soldiers read the mathematics of the room the same way every soldier reads it when the numbers turn. They set down their weapons. Celeste looked at Alaric. "You will regret this," she said. Her voice was steady. Even now, even stripped of every advantage, every alliance, every layer of carefully constructed influence, the steadiness was not courage. It was the reflex of a woman who had been performing strength for so long that she no longer knew how to stop, even when the performance was playing to an empty house. "No," Alaric said. "I will regret the 18 months I spent believing you. I will regret every decision I made because you steered me toward it. I will regret standing in this hall and announcing you as something you were never qualified to be. Those are my regrets. This moment is not one of them." Celeste's jaw tightened. She held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked toward the door. She made it 4 steps before Seraphine's voice stopped her. "Lady Celeste." Celeste stopped. She did not turn around. The financial audit of the Arden family's holdings has been submitted to the Imperial Council. Every contract, every covert payment, every letter between your family and the houses that conspired to weaken this dominion. The Council will review the evidence when the session reconvenes. I would suggest retaining very good legal counsel. Celeste stood motionless in the middle of the great hall. The torchlight threw her shadow long across the stone floor, stretching it toward the door she had been walking to, as though even her shadow was trying to escape what was coming. She walked out without another word. The doors closed behind her, and in the silence that followed, in the great hall of a castle that had survived 6 sieges and 3 civil wars and 2 centuries of men who believed that holding its walls meant holding its power, Duke Alaric Voss turned to face the woman who had just saved his dominion. He opened his mouth to speak, and then the sound reached them. Distant, from the east wing, the crash of breaking wood followed by shouts, followed by the unmistakable ring of steel on steel that every person who has ever lived through violence recognizes in the marrow of their bones before their conscious mind has time to process it. Halleck went white. "The east wing. My lord, the east wing is Seraphine's quarters," Alaric finished. They were already moving. Alaric grabbed a sword from the nearest household guard without asking. Seraphine was 3 steps ahead of him, running toward the corridor that led to the east wing, toward the rooms where she had spent 5 years building the invisible architecture of an empire, where her writing desk held the remaining evidence, where the final drawer contained documents that could dismantle the Arden conspiracy down to its foundations. The corridor ahead was dark, and from somewhere inside that darkness came the sounds of men who had been sent to destroy everything Seraphine had built before the council could see it. Celeste had not come to Blackthorne alone with 12 soldiers. She had come with a contingency. Alaric reached the east wing corridor first. His body made the decision before his mind finished calculating. 12 years of battlefield instinct overriding 10 hours of exhaustion, overriding 2 days without sleep, overriding the rational voice in his skull that said a duke does not charge into an ambush carrying a borrowed sword and no armor. The rational voice had governed his decisions for most of his adult life. It had kept him alive on battlefields and in parliamentary chambers and in every calculated encounter where survival depended on weighing outcomes before committing to action. He was done weighing. The East Wing corridor was narrow, built in an era when castle architects understood that narrow passages favored defenders over attackers. Torchlight from wall brackets threw stuttering light across the stone floor. Ahead, the sound sharpened into distinct elements. Wood splintering, a man shouting orders, the percussive crash of furniture being overturned. Seraphine's writing desk. They were destroying the writing desk. He rounded the corner and found them. 6 men. Not garrison soldiers, not Arden house guards in formal livery. These were different. Unmarked leather armor, short swords designed for close quarters work, the professional equipment of men hired for a specific job that required speed, violence, and the absence of anything that could be traced back to whoever paid them. Mercenaries. Celeste had hired mercenaries. The nearest one saw Alaric and reacted with the trained efficiency of a man who expected opposition. He pivoted, blade up, weight centered, professional. The kind of professional that costs serious money and delivers serious results. Alaric did not slow down. The borrowed sword was heavier than his personal weapon, balanced differently, the grip worn smooth by another man's hand. None of that mattered. Combat at close range is not about precision. It is about commitment. The willingness to close distance faster than the other man expects, to convert the gap between intention and action into the only advantage that matters in the first 2 seconds of a fight. He drove into the nearest mercenary with his shoulder, using his height and forward momentum to collapse the man's guard before the blade could find its angle. The impact sent both of them into the corridor wall. Alaric felt the stone against his left shoulder, felt the mercenary's breath against his neck, felt the man's sword arm trapped between their bodies. He brought the pommel of his borrowed sword down on the man's wrist. The crack of bone was sharp and immediate. The mercenary's weapon clattered to the floor. 5 remaining. 2 of them had been inside Seraphine's quarters. They emerged through the doorway carrying armfuls of documents, papers, ledgers, sealed correspondence. The evidence. The financial audit, the charter documentation, the ardent correspondence that Seraphine had spent 14 months compiling with the patience of a woman who understood that the most dangerous weapon in any empire is not steel, but information. They were trying to burn it. He could smell the smoke. Someone had started a fire inside the room. "Drop them." Alaric's voice came out raw, stripped of the practiced authority he normally deployed. This was not the voice of a duke commanding subordinates. This was the voice of a man standing between destruction and something he had finally learned to value. "Drop them now." The mercenaries did not drop them. Mercenaries do not respond to authority. They respond to payment and to the immediate calculus of whether the threat in front of them outweighs the reward behind them. Alaric moved forward. The fight in the corridor was nothing like the battles that songs were written about. There was no elegance to it, no choreography, no dramatic exchange of blade work between evenly matched opponents. It was cramped, brutal, and governed by the physics of narrow spaces where a taller man with a longer reach has the advantage if he keeps the engagement close and does not let anyone circle behind him. He took a cut across his left forearm from a blade he did not see in time. The pain registered as heat followed by numbness, which meant the cut was deep enough to bleed freely, but not deep enough to cost him function. He filed the information the way soldiers file damage reports during contact, noted, prioritized, and deferred until the immediate threat was resolved. The household guards arrived 90 seconds later. 32 men pouring into the East Wing corridor with the particular fury of career servants who had just been told that strangers were burning rooms in the castle they had spent their lives protecting. The mercenaries, outnumbered and cornered, made the same calculation every professional makes when the odds shift beyond recovery. 4 surrendered. 1 tried to run and was caught by a household guard who had 30 years of memorized corridors and a deep personal investment in the outcome. The 6th, the one Alaric had disabled in the first seconds, was pulled from the floor and restrained. Alaric pushed through the doorway into Seraphine's quarters. The room was damaged, but not destroyed. A fire had been started in the corner using papers from the writing desk as kindling. The flames had spread to a curtain and scorched the wall behind it before the lack of airflow in the stone chamber starved them. Smoke hung in the air like a gray veil. The writing desk itself had been overturned, its drawers pulled out and emptied. Papers covered the floor in scattered drifts, but the desk had a false bottom. Alaric knew this now because Seraphine was already kneeling beside it, her hands working a concealed latch that released a panel in the desk's base. From the hidden compartment, she pulled a leather folio, thick with documents, sealed with the Delacourt crest, the complete audit, the original copies, everything the mercenaries had been sent to destroy. Seraphine looked up at Alaric. Her face was smudged with smoke. Her blue dress was torn at the shoulder where she had pressed through the household guards to reach the room. Her hands, holding the leather folio, were steady. "You are bleeding," she said. Alaric looked at his left arm. The sleeve of his formal coat was dark with blood from the elbow down. The cut was longer than he had estimated during the fight, running from mid-forearm nearly to the wrist. It would need stitching. It would scar. "I know. Sit down before you fall." "I'm not going to fall." "Alaric, sit down." He sat. On the floor of her damaged quarters, surrounded by scattered papers and the acrid residue of a fire that had almost consumed everything she had built, he sat with his back against the overturned writing desk and let the exhaustion arrive. It came in waves. First the physical weight, the muscles in his legs and shoulders finally surrendering the tension they had carried through 10 hours of writing and 20 minutes of combat. Then the cognitive weight, the accumulated impact of revelations and betrayals, and the systematic demolition of every assumption he had constructed his identity around. And beneath both of those, something deeper, heavier. The weight of 5 years of damage he had inflicted on the woman now kneeling beside him, tearing a strip from her own dress to wrap around his forearm. She tied the bandage with quick, practiced hands. Not gentle, efficient. The hands of a woman who dealt with problems by solving them, not by performing sympathy over them. The mercenaries were a contingency, she said while she worked. Celeste knew the audit existed. She did not know where the originals were stored, but she knew that destroying this room was her last option if everything else failed. Everything else did fail. Yes, because of you. Seraphine finished the bandage. She sat back on her heels and looked at him with the expression he was learning to read. Not the diplomatic mask she wore in public. Not the careful composure she maintained when others were watching. The actual expression. Tired, angry, relieved. And beneath all of those, something that looked like grief for all the versions of this moment that would never exist now. The versions where he had seen her clearly from the beginning. The versions where she had not needed to fight a war inside her own marriage to prove she was worth listening to. Because of me, she said, and because of Marjorie, and Lockwood, and Governor Harlan, and every person in this dominion who chose to trust a woman the rest of the empire dismissed as decoration. I did not do this alone, Alaric. That is the part you still do not understand. You think power is a solo performance, a man standing on a mountain declaring himself king. It is not. It never was. Everything that keeps this empire running is built on the willingness of 100 people to show up every day and do work that nobody applauds. He looked at her. The smoke was clearing. Through the damaged window, the first light of full morning was reaching the east wing, turning the stone walls from gray to the pale gold that Blackthorne wore in the early hours before the mountain shadows reclaimed it. I know, he said. 2 words, insufficient for the magnitude of what they were meant to carry. But he said them without performance, without the rhetorical architecture he normally built around every statement to ensure it landed with maximum authority. He said them the way a man says something true when the truth is the only thing left in his inventory. Seraphine held his gaze for a long time. Then she stood, picked up the leather folio, and walked to the door. We have work to do, she said. The council reconvenes in 2 days. Celeste and her people need to be formally charged. The garrison needs to be restaffed, and someone needs to put out the rest of that fire. She left. Alaric sat on the floor of her quarters for another minute, bleeding through the bandage on his arm, breathing smoke, staring at the overturned writing desk that 3 generations of Delacourt women had used to build the foundation his entire empire rested on. Then he stood and followed. The next 48 hours moved with the dense, compressed rhythm of an empire restructuring itself in real time. Celeste was detained before she reached the Blackthorne gates. Rendell's garrison soldiers, reoriented by the combination of Alaric's physical return and the proof that Celeste's authorization documents were fabricated, intercepted her escort on the main road. She was brought back to the castle under guard and confined to the West Wing quarters she had occupied for 18 months, surrounded now by the locked doors and stationed soldiers that transformed familiar rooms into a prison. Alaric did not visit her. There was nothing to say that the evidence had not already said, and he had learned, in the span of 2 weeks that felt like a geological age, that the conversations worth having were not always the ones that provided the most satisfaction. Captain Rendell submitted his resignation to Alaric in the war room on the morning after the East Wing assault. He stood at attention in front of the maps he had spent 3 years studying under a command structure he had just betrayed, and he delivered his resignation with the flat precision of a man who understood that the best outcome available to him was disgrace rather than execution. I believe the documentation was genuine, my lord. That does not excuse the failure of judgment. No, Alaric said, it does not. I accept whatever consequences the Dominion determines. Alaric studied the captain. Rendell was not a villain. He was a competent administrator who had been placed in an impossible situation by people who understood that competent administrators follow procedure, and procedure can be weaponized by anyone willing to forge the right paperwork. You are relieved of command. Your rank is suspended pending review by the military tribunal. You will cooperate fully with the investigation into the Arden Network's infiltration of the garrison command structure. Yes, my lord. And Rendell? My lord? The next time someone presents you with documents authorizing the removal of your commanding officer, verify them before you redeploy 400 soldiers. That is not a sophisticated tactical insight. That is basic due diligence. Yes, my lord. Rendell left. Alaric stood alone in the war room. The maps surrounded him as they always had. But he noticed, for the first time, that the annotations covering every wall were exclusively in his handwriting. Territorial boundaries, resource positions, military deployments. The visible record of 12 years of command, every mark reflecting a decision he had made based on information he believed he controlled. Not one annotation referenced trade charters. Not one referenced economic infrastructure. Not one referenced the financial systems that funded every military operation, every territorial acquisition, every strategic initiative documented on these walls. He had mapped the surface of his empire with meticulous care and never once mapped what lay beneath it. He picked up a pen. In the margin of the eastern territorial map, beside the trade route that connected the mountain mines to the southern ports, he wrote a single word in handwriting that no one else would ever need to read. Delacourt. Then he set down the pen and went to find his wife. The Imperial Council reconvened on a Tuesday. Seraphine presented the complete financial audit to the full assembly. The evidence was comprehensive, methodical, and devastating. 10 years of covert financial manipulation by the Arden family and their allied houses, documented through contracts, payment records, correspondence, and the testimony of 3 provincial administrators who had been approached by Arden intermediaries and had, on Seraphine's advice, maintained records of every interaction. The council deliberated for 6 hours. When the deliberation concluded, the speaker announced the following actions. The Arden family's noble titles were suspended pending criminal investigation. All military contracts awarded to Arden-affiliated houses were voided. Lord Devereux, Sir Marcus Hale, and Viscount Ennerly were stripped of their parliamentary seats and referred to the imperial judiciary for prosecution. Lady Celeste Arden was formally charged with conspiracy against the Dominion of Blackthorne, fabrication of imperial authorization documents, and the deployment of mercenary forces against a sitting duke's household. And the Delacourt trade charters, all 17 of them, were formally recognized by the Imperial Council as the legal economic foundation of the Blackthorne Dominion. Joint governance authority over trade and financial policy was established between Duke Alaric Voss and Duchess Seraphine Voss, codified in a council resolution that required both signatures for any modification to the Dominion's economic operations. The resolution passed with a majority that surprised no one who had been paying attention. 21 of 23 noble houses voted in favor. The 2 dissenting votes came from houses with minor financial connections to the Arden network, and their dissent was noted with the particular attention that imperial record keepers reserve for names they expect to encounter again during subsequent investigations. After the vote, Alaric stood before the council. He had prepared remarks. Careful, strategic statements designed to reframe the crisis as an opportunity and to position the restructured Dominion as stronger than it had been before the conspiracy was exposed. He set the prepared remarks aside. I stood in this chamber 3 weeks ago and believed I was the architect of Blackthorne's prosperity. I was wrong. The architect has been standing beside me for 5 years, and I was too certain of my own importance to see it. The chamber was quiet. Not the trained quiet of protocol. The genuine quiet of 300 people hearing a powerful man say something they did not expect. The Dominion of Blackthorne was not built by military conquest. It was built by economic infrastructure that my wife's family created, maintained, and protected, while 3 generations of my family took credit for the results. I do not say this to diminish what the Voss name has contributed. I say it because an empire that does not understand its own foundations is an empire waiting to collapse. He paused. The words that came next cost him something. He could feel the expenditure in his chest, in the tightness of his throat. in the particular effort required to speak truth in a room designed for performance. I also want to acknowledge publicly what the Duchess did, not the political strategy, not the charter leverage, not the evidence that exposed the Arden conspiracy. What she did was survive 5 years of being dismissed by the person who should have valued her most, and she survived it without becoming the kind of person who dismisses others. That is not political skill. That is something harder. Something I am only beginning to understand. He sat down. Seraphine did not react visibly. She sat in her seat at the council table, her hands folded, her expression carrying the composed calm that 300 people had mistaken for emptiness for 5 years. But beneath the table, where no one could see, her hands tightened against each other with the pressure of a woman absorbing the weight of a moment she had imagined 1,000 times and never truly believed would arrive. They returned to Blackthorne separately. Different carriages, different routes. The physical distance was practical. Security protocols required staggered travel for senior members of the Dominion until the garrison restructuring was complete, but the distance was also accurate. Emotional geography cannot be collapsed by a single speech, however honest. The damage of 5 years does not heal in 3 weeks, and both of them understood that the space between what Alaric had said at the council and what their marriage actually was remained vast, unmapped, and without guarantee of safe passage. Alaric arrived first. He went to the war room out of habit, then stopped in the doorway. The maps stared back at him. Every wall covered with the visible record of a man who believed that controlling territory was the same as building something worth defending. He turned and walked to the east wing instead. Seraphine's quarters had been repaired. New curtains replaced the burned ones. The writing desk had been restored to its position beneath the window, its surface cleared, its drawers empty. The false compartment in the base remained, still holding the space where the leather folio had been stored. Alaric ran his hand across the desk's surface. The wood was smooth, aged by decades of use, warmed by the hands of women who had sat here writing letters that moved more resources than his armies ever had. He sat in Seraphine's chair, not because he intended to claim the space, because he wanted to see what she saw. The view from the east wing window was different from the view in his study. His window faced the ramparts and the mountain road, the military approach, the angle of authority. Her window faced east, toward the valleys where the trade routes ran, toward the ports and market towns and the sprawling economic network that she had spent 5 years tending while he stood at his own window watching soldiers march along walls. 2 windows. 2 views. The same castle, the same empire. And for 5 years they had looked at it from different directions and never once compared what they saw. Seraphine found him there an hour later. She stood in the doorway of her own quarters and looked at the Duke of Blackthorne sitting at her writing desk, staring out her window, wearing an expression she had never seen from him in 5 years of marriage. Not authority, not calculation, not the practiced blankness he wore like armor. Uncertainty. The genuine, unperformed uncertainty of a man who has been stripped of the story he told himself about who he was and has not yet figured out what story comes next. "You're in my chair," she said. "I know." He did not move. "I wanted to see what you see." She crossed the room and stood beside the window. The late afternoon light caught the valleys below, turning the trade roads into thin lines of gold against the green and gray landscape. "What do you see?" she asked. "Everything I missed." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not empty but full, loaded with the weight of decisions that have not yet been made, and the recognition that the next word spoken will determine whether the space between 2 people narrows or remains permanent. "Alaric, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it without interpreting it as an attack." "Go ahead." "I did not do any of this for you. Not the charters, not the political network, not the audit. I did it because the Dominion needed it, and nobody else was going to do it, and I refuse to live inside a structure that survives on luck rather than competence." "I understand." "I do not think you do. Because what I am telling you is that if you disappeared tomorrow, if you walked out of this castle and never returned, the Dominion would continue to function. The trade routes would operate. The financial systems would hold. The military would be funded through charter agreements that exist independently of whoever occupies the Duke's chair. I built something that does not need you, and that is the part you have to come to terms with before anything else between us can change." The words landed with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Not cruel, not vindictive, accurate. The truth stated without embellishment by a woman who had spent 5 years embellishing nothing. Alaric looked at her. The afternoon light was behind her now, casting her face in shadow while the valleys and the trade roads and the economic infrastructure of an empire she had quietly sustained glowed golden over her shoulder. "You're right," he said. "The Dominion does not need me. You prove that. The question is whether it works better with me in it or without me. That depends entirely on which version of you we are discussing. The version sitting in your chair. That version showed up 3 weeks ago. The version I lived with for 5 years would never have sat in this chair, would never have looked out this window, would never have asked what I see because the question itself would have implied that my perspective had value. It does have value. I know it does. I have always known. The question was whether you would ever figure it out." He stood from the chair. Not quickly. With the deliberate movement of a man who understands that the space he is vacating is not his to occupy. He stood and faced her and let the distance between them exist without trying to close it through force or declaration, or the reflexive exercise of authority that had governed every interaction of his adult life. "I do not know how to do this," he said. The admission came out rough, unpolished, the verbal equivalent of a man setting down weapons he has carried so long that his hands do not remember how to be empty. "I do not know how to stand beside someone without trying to stand above them. I do not know how to share authority. I have spent my entire life converting everything around me into territory I control. And I'm looking at you right now, and every instinct I have is telling me to find the angle, find the leverage, find the mechanism that makes this situation mine. And I know, standing here, that those instincts are exactly what brought me to the edge of losing everything." Seraphine studied him, not with the careful diplomatic assessment she used in public settings, with the direct, unguarded attention of a woman deciding whether the words she is hearing are performance or substance. "Then we start there," she said. "Not with promises, not with declarations, not with the kind of grand gestures you use to overwhelm rooms full of people into compliance. We start with the fact that you do not know how to do this, and we figure it out the way I build everything, slowly, carefully, with documentation." The corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Something smaller. Something that existed in the space between history and possibility, between the damage already done and the uncertain territory of what might still be built. Alaric exhaled, a long, controlled breath. The kind of breath a man takes when he sets something heavy down and realizes that the weight he has been carrying was not strength. It was just weight. "Where do we start?" "Dinner," Seraphine said. "We start with dinner. You sit across from me and you eat, and you tell me one thing about the Dominion you do not understand. Not one thing you conquered, not one thing you commanded, one thing you do not understand. One thing. One thing, every night. And I will tell you one thing I built while you were not looking. That could take years. I have been here for 5. I am not in a hurry." She walked to the door, paused, turned back. "And Alaric." "Yes." "Stay out of my chair." She left. Alaric stood alone in the East Wing quarters of a woman who had rebuilt his empire from the inside while he decorated its surface. The writing desk sat beneath the window. The chair was empty. The view of the valleys stretched out below, golden in the fading light, every road and route and connection visible from this angle that he had never once thought to seek. He did not sit in the chair again. He stood beside it, looking out, learning the view. Weeks became months. The imperial investigation into the Arden conspiracy expanded to include 11 noble houses whose financial connections to the network had been concealed through layers of intermediary transactions. Celeste stood trial before the imperial judiciary and was convicted on all charges. Her titles were permanently revoked. Her family's estates were seized. She was exiled to the Western Territories with a maintenance allowance and the instruction to never set foot in the capital again. Alaric did not attend the trial. Seraphine did. She sat in the gallery and watched the proceedings with the composed attention of a woman who understood that justice, like architecture, requires someone to show up and verify that the structure is sound. The Dominion of Blackthorne stabilized. Trade routes resumed their normal operations. Military funding was restored through restructured charter agreements that now bore both the Voss and Delacourt seals. The silver mines produced at full capacity. The timber shipments arrived on schedule. The invisible machinery of an empire continued to function because the person who maintained it was finally visible. The noble houses of Valamir adjusted their understanding of the Blackthorne power structure with the pragmatic speed that characterizes aristocracies everywhere. Where they had once ignored Seraphine, they now sought her counsel. Where they had once treated her as decoration, they now treated her as what she had always been, the person who understood how the empire actually worked. Alaric watched this adjustment with an expression that his household staff could not quite categorize. Not resentment, not the wounded pride of a man watching someone else receive the recognition he once monopolized. Something quieter. Something that might have been, if any of them had dared name it, the particular peace that comes from watching someone you damaged receive what they were owed. Every evening, they sat across from each other at dinner. He asked questions. She answered them. He learned about trade charter law and merchant guild politics and the financial infrastructure that connected Blackthorne's military operations to a network of economic relationships spanning 3 generations of Delacourt women. She learned things too, not about military strategy or political dominance. She learned about the man behind the authority, the boy who had been raised by a father who defined love as the absence of weakness and affection as a vulnerability that enemies could exploit. The young commander who had won his first battle at 22 and spent the next 16 years trying to replicate the certainty of that victory in every other domain of his life. The husband who had stood beside her on their wedding day and felt nothing because he had been taught that feeling was a failure of discipline. She did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not the right word for what happened between them because forgiveness implies a completion, a closing of accounts, a transaction that settles the balance and allows both parties to move forward as though the debt has been paid. What happened instead was slower, less definitive, more honest. She allowed space for the possibility that the man sitting across from her was not the same man who had publicly discarded her at the Winter Ascension Ball. And he earned that space not through grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but through the small, unremarkable, daily act of showing up and asking questions he did not know the answers to. A year later, the songs had already started. Ballads about the Winter Ascension Ball, about the Duke who announced a new Duchess and the wife who smiled, about the silent woman who dismantled an empire's power structure without raising her voice and rebuilt it without asking for credit. The songs were not entirely accurate. Songs never are. They compressed 5 years of invisible work into a single dramatic narrative. They turned Seraphine into a legend of quiet vengeance and Alaric into a cautionary tale about the blindness of powerful men. The truth was more complicated. It always is. But the songs got one thing right. On a winter evening, with snow falling on the Ashenvale Mountains and the trade roads below glowing faintly with the lanterns of merchant caravans still running on schedule, because someone had made sure they would, Duke Alaric Voss sat across from his wife at dinner and told her something he did not understand. And she told him something she had built while he was not looking. And for one evening, in a castle that had survived 6 sieges and 3 civil wars, and the slow, difficult reconstruction of a marriage that most people would have abandoned, 2 people sat together and did the hardest thing that power ever demands. They treated each other as equals, not because a council ordered it, not because a charter required it, not because the political calculus made it advantageous, because the man who once owned everything had finally learned that the only things worth having are the things that choose to stay.